Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Greg Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. With Veterans Day ahead of us, I thought it was a perfect time to talk to my dear friend, Jen McCoy. I worked with McCoy for years at the Portage Daily Register in Portage, Wisconsin. As a community journalist, McCoy covered a number of topics, including the education beat. But she also worked on an ongoing series to tell the stories of local veterans. Over time, she earned their respect by telling their stories earnestly and with compassion. I wanted to have McCoy on the show to talk about writing these profiles and also about an intense experience she had covering the death of a local soldier during the Afghan war. The conversation, I think, is prescient because I think there's a lot of us with family members who served in the military who want to talk to their loved ones about their experiences to understand them better and to preserve the record for the family's future generations. I also talked to McCoy about her difficult decision to leave the newspaper business after a decade of work. You joined the Portage Daily Register in your early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And not long after you started working there, you started profiling veterans, telling their stories in kind of like an ongoing series, right? How did that kind of like come to you?
So the editor at the time assigned it to me, actually. And it was kind of an uncomfortable beat to be put on because I'm, not a veteran. I have veterans in my family, but this was obviously after 9/11, and I wasn't sure how veterans in general would feel opening up. I didn't know really how to start the conversation or what the conversation even was.
What was kind of the reason that they kind of gave you, like, why the editor wanted to kind of like take this on as a focus, why they wanted to do that? What was in it for the newspaper to want to profile veterans?
So it started out as just World War II veterans. And the editor had, I think at his previous paper, done the same thing. And so, it was just kind of a race against time for the people who were still living, and still are living, in terms of capturing their stories, and with age, how much you can remember, and also how much you're willing to share, because it's extraordinarily personal and vulnerable. And I think the benefit to the paper was, here are the people that, you see in your community that go to your church or that are at the community center or, the greeters at a store. And here's who they really are. Here's their life story. And it's scary and sad and intense and hopeful and loving and much bigger than I think people had explored, because I think people hadn't asked them before, or they weren't ready to talk about it.
And you were saying earlier that you had some trepidation about taking on the task. You were like 23, 24 when you were doing this at the start. Tell me about like the first one that you go in and do. What were kind of the thoughts going in through your head when you sat down for the first time with a veteran, and how did that go?
I remember the first veteran that I interviewed. He lived on Silver Lake Drive. And I still remember the house, and his son was there, and he had kind of a book or a memoir about the battles that he had been in. I don't think it was specifically about him, but the inference was that I knew my history, which I don't, but I learned over time. And it was intimidating because the questions I think that are intriguing to people on the outside of it are, what did it look like? What did you do? What did you see? But I always started with, what year were you born? and what was your childhood like? And then moved into, when you're 16 and Pearl Harbor happens, where were you? And then take it from there, because jumping right into, so you were, in the Pacific, it doesn't garner any trust, because I don't have a dialogue with them as a person first. And the interviews would take, the first one probably took 3 to 4 hours, which the editor wasn't that pleased with. But I didn't know what I needed to write, and I didn't know what was the story, and so eventually I think he talked about being a paratrooper and jumping out of a plane into a swamp and kind of getting underneath the water there so that he wasn't found out. You start the dialogue, and then all of these untold stories start to kind of come to fruition. And I think it helped that I was young, because I, didn't have any personal connection to it. My grandfather was a Marine in World War II, but I'm not a family member. I'm not a friend, although I would like to consider myself a friend, friendly to people.
Like, how many of these did you do over the years? Quite a few.
Yeah, I want to say maybe 40. And they have them chronicled, I think, in the Portage Museum. Quite a few. I think I did probably every weekend for a couple of years. When I was working weekends, I did them. And they all would take hours and hours, because I'm asking them to ease into this incredible foreign territory of personal trauma that a lot of times they haven't even talked with their spouses about. So I had, it takes a long time to, like I said before, kind of get into the motion and the rhythm of a conversation where somebody will say, and then this is what happened. And surprisingly, a lot of times they would cry. And I 100% would cry with them, because how could you not be moved?
So did you eventually start enjoying it? You said at first that it was tough to do, but did over time you kind of become passionate about telling these stories?
Yeah. It was a slow trickle at the beginning of people wanting to talk. I think then as it kind of moved forward, it gained momentum, and then there were a number of people that I couldn't get to, because I like to think that hopefully people contacted me because they thought that I did it justice to the best of my ability. And, I remember one man that I really am fond of, and his name was Clem Evans. And, I went to his house on a Saturday, and his wife had us sit at their table with their china, and we had tea and cookies, and it was very intimate and very cathartic. And I was very passionate about it because, these were real people looking at you in the eyes and telling you some really scary, intense stuff. And how could I not be passionate for everything that they've been through? I don't think I enjoyed it, but I know that I enjoyed the connection with the person. It was hard to hear some of the things, but I can't say that that pales in comparison to the person having to do it themselves. Like, I don't want to overshadow that at all.
Did it change the way you think of what war is?
Yeah, it did. Because I was, before the Iraq War started, I went to D.C. with some of my friends, and I protested the war, and I've always been very engaged in social justice. And I had a preconceived notion of who enlisted, even though my dad was, in the Vietnam era, and my uncle. It changed the way I look at war because everybody who went through it had a different experience. Like Clem said, I hate war and it's horrible. And, everybody basically had the same message, but like for some people, they, said it was necessary because they had to take on the Nazis to stop this hate fuel from taking over the world.
You keep mentioning family members, not only the vet telling their story, the family members around the veterans kind of being participatory in the listening of these. Was that a common occurrence where a son or a wife was there in the room listening to the story as well, or hearing this story for the first time?
Yeah, it was. And if not hearing the whole story, at least hearing parts that they hadn't heard before. And I think the benefit of that was, I wasn't related to the person. I didn't have a visceral reaction to, but that's my dad or my grandfather or my spouse. I can't believe they would have done that, or I can't believe they went through that, because I was neutral. I was just saying, could you tell me about this date and time, and where were you and what happened, and what did you smell? What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear? What did you taste? And a lot of times it was very emotional for the other people listening as well. And hopefully it shed a little bit of light and some more perspective on the person that they were attached to, giving them some credit for the trauma that each and every person went through, because regardless of how they, what branch they were in or what theater they were in, they were traumatized. And that's like the overall message, was that war is hell. If it's a necessary evil, then they went to go fight it. But regardless, it's hell.
A lot of veterans, I think my grandfather was like this. He definitely had some trauma. I mean, how do you not have trauma going to war? But he internalized it. I never saw it in him, but it was definitely there. Did a lot of the veterans that you spoke to feel it viscerally when they were talking about it? Was it something that they really could not shake? I mean, even you're talking to these people who had these experiences 50 years ago, but were they pretty clear in their minds and how they felt at the time?
Very. Yeah. They, a lot of times, it was like they were there yesterday, because, one of the gentlemen was a sniper, and he still had nightmares. And his wife was there talking with me, and she said, yeah, he still has nightmares. He wakes up and will be screaming, thinking that there's a helicopter coming down. Or there was one man that at some points felt like he needed to patrol the streets, this where he lived in this community, because he was so traumatized. It came out in certain points with different people. Sometimes anger, sometimes crying, sometimes trying to make light of something because it was so horrific that if you can't look at it through that lens, then maybe you couldn't look at it at all. But they weren't trivializing it. Like, they were all suffering. That was a common thread.
And what was kind of the reaction that a lot of these articles got when they were printed in the paper, in the community, whether it was the veterans themselves or just other people reading them?
So for the veterans, from what I understand that they told me, they felt validated and seen and heard. And I don't know that they were ready to be seen or heard previously. I'm not saying I'm a magic ticket or anything that made them speak, but a lot of times people would say they came home from war and that was it. And so you did your job, you came home, you were the lucky one if you came home, and you went on with life because that's how it was. Because you had a wife at home and 3 kids, or because you had to take care of the farm or work on the railroad. It's uncomfortable to say it, but because I don't feel that this is, I don't feel that I should take any credit for somebody else's life and their actions, but I got gratitude from the veterans. The VFW and the American Legion felt like a second home. I'd go in there, and after I had done it for a few years, because I did it for about 9 years, people knew what my name was. They'd always ask me to have a beer in the bar. And of course I couldn't, but I wanted to.
Right.
And there would be bingo at the hall, and there'd always be Swiss steak by this gentleman named Jake, who was one of the oldest World War II veterans, and he was always in the galley cooking. And from the community, I'm not sure what the impetus was, but one of the history teachers at the high school started a Veterans Day ceremony, and that started gaining momentum. I covered that, and that started gaining momentum. And then I think at the last one that I covered, there were 86 veterans. So it went from, maybe 15 to 40. I think as people started to feel seen and heard and not judged, they were more, I can't say how they felt, but I would say that it wasn't ancient history. It wasn't something just that it was in a 7th grade history book. It was this person that's sitting in the gym, and at one point they had a strong jaw and strong shoulders, and, they were 23 and they had the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they're, now in their 80s and 90s. And I think maybe people looked at them differently. Like, this person has been, one of them was a POW, a couple of them were.
Do you have any advice for other people who they have a veteran in their family and they want to hear the story, but they've never done it? They've always wanted to do it. They've always wanted to talk to their grandpa or their husband or their uncle about their experience in the war. Do you have any advice for them and how to approach it, how to get them talking about it, to share their story so that they can document it and just kind of share that with the family?
Yeah, I think the way to start is to start at the beginning the way that I did. A lot of times, I think the fear was, are you going to ask me if I killed somebody? And the answer to that is, they probably did, because they were going to be killed. And you have to assume that that's part of war, and also have no judgment going into it. This person is still your grandfather or your spouse or your uncle. I think bringing out things like, did you have a nickname during your time? Bringing out little things that might enter into the bigger story, I think, are touchstones. Or do you keep in touch with anybody from your platoon? Tell me a little bit about your best friend there. And I can't say that that's a magic pill and that that'll work, but when you make sure to humanize somebody's story and don't just say, something highly offensive like, did you take somebody else's life? Which is really hard for people to talk about. And some people talked about it, and I never asked that question. That's too visceral. You can't start there. You have to start at the beginning, which is, hey, you were young once too, and that was really scary, and you're a human. And I think one of the keys is to just not judge or react when people are going to open their hearts to you. If you don't want it to be unfiltered, then just be open to the fact that this person might tell you things that you never associated with them. And I think that's okay. And I think that releases some of the trauma, I would hope. And maybe has you see them in a different light too. And hopefully in a more whole way. You see the whole person. And everybody deserves that. One
of the biggest articles that you worked on at the Daily Register was a story of a young soldier that didn't make it home. In February of 2009, Sergeant Daniel Thompson, whose family lived in Portage, was killed on a convoy in Afghanistan, killed by an IED that blew up his Humvee and killed him and 3 others. You ended up playing a big role in the coverage of that story. What were some of the immediate things that you did when the news broke that day?
The first thing I did was I started crying, and I walked up the stairs to the publisher's office, and I said, I can't do this. I said, I can't do this story. And he looked at me and he said, no, you can do it. And I said, look at me, I'm crying, as I am now. And he said, that's okay. Just get the story. And when I say the story, I mean the life, I don't mean to trivialize. Nobody's, life is a story or a paragraph or a feature or anything like that. He was reassuring to me because he basically said, go as you are, because something very important to me is being authentic to myself. And so I remember I called the bar, which his mother owned, and this was her only child, and somebody picked up, and I was crying. And I said, is so-and-so there? And they said no. And I don't really recall what I said, but I said, I'm so sorry. I just want to talk to her, but I understand if she doesn't. And I believe that was her brother. And he told me later that he felt like because I had cried on the phone and wasn't pushing for, quote unquote, a story, he felt like I was the right person to enter the house at that time. So I think vulnerability and being authentic really, although it's can be not that attractive, not that easy, I think it garners respect from people. And also, if I'm willing to be vulnerable with somebody, then they're willing to be vulnerable with me. So I just remember going into knocking on the door of this White House, and there were a lot of people in the house, and I've had a lot of deaths in my family personally. And so I know what the refrain is, and it's basically somebody's died. There's a ton of food there. People bring over casseroles and flowers and stuff, and you can't eat worth anything. And it's an out-of-body experience. And I knew that that's what I was going to be walking into, and it was. And his best friend opened the door, who was, the same age. And a firefighter, and a police officer for the local area. And it was kind of odd. It was like people kind of made a part in this line of kind of receiving. It was almost like people were standing in front of her in order to protect her, which of course you would. And she was sitting at the kitchen table, and I don't recall if I hugged her or not, but I know that I was crying and I was scared. And I think to a certain extent because she's a mom, and I 100% still consider her a mother because she is. Doesn't matter if your child's alive or not. We sat down at the table, and other people kind of seemed to kind of back into the woodwork, and I said, can we look at some of his baby pictures? And I said, tell me about what it was like to be pregnant with him. And that's where we started. Like I started with all the World War II veterans. Start at the beginning because the end of your life doesn't define it. And so for hours, I sat there with her looking at pictures of him with a cute little baseball cap on, as a 2-year-old holding a baseball, shot in like a Sears, portrait studio like I had done at one point. And she showed me his bedroom, and she showed me the roses that he gave her when he left that were dried and still in the house. And as kind of the time went on, more and more things started to open up. And I recall that there was a TV station outside their house. And I asked them, the family, do you want me to talk to them? And they said yes. And so I went outside to talk to the TV station, and I said, here's the deal. They're in the throes of grief. I can ask them if they want to talk to you or not, but that's not my call. And this isn't to be trite or anything. There just is inherently a little bit of a, who gets the story first between print and TV. TV almost always wins because it's a quick turnaround and it's on the 6 o'clock news or what have you. Eventually, they came outside, the family did, and had a kind of a snippet done about them. But, his fiance was there, and his dad and his mom, and that day, they found out he died. They let me into their house and into their hearts, and I remember taking a picture of them sitting on the couch holding a portrait of Daniel in his dress blues. And I said, you don't have to look at me. You don't have to do anything. You just be. And I remember his fiancée, Maria, was wearing one of his sweatshirts, as was his mother, because they said they felt like that was as close as they could physically get to him at the time.
Through the course of about a week after this, they were waiting for his body to come home. And you were, in some sense, kind of embedded with the family when they went to pick up his body at the airport in Madison to bring him home to Portage. Talk to me a little bit about that experience, and were you again afraid to enter that situation and be a part of that situation again? And what was the kind of the reason that they asked you, do you think, to be a part of that?
His mom asked me if I would go with them. And I was terrified. Very terrified. I couldn't sleep the night before because I didn't know what it was going to be like. And I didn't have any bearings about this is how it happens, and this is the cargo plane that Daniel's in, or this is the circumstances, and, on and on. But a mother asking you to be present, to witness and document the life of her son through the story of him passing away, and then the amount of trust and grace that she had to ask me to accompany them to claim his body was mind-blowing. I remember going back to the office, the newspaper office, and my editor couldn't believe that they asked me to go with. And I couldn't believe that they asked me to go with. And I didn't know what I would write. But I just remember it was almost like I wasn't doing it. Something was doing it through me, because I had a somewhat of a barrier, a boundary with my notepad and my camera. And so, when I was writing in the car with them towards the tarmac, I remember taking pictures of his mother kissing his dad, and then, his fiance, leaning her head on Daniel's mom's shoulder. And this really intense quiet and strangeness of when is the plane going to land, and then what happens. And I wasn't the only person there that had that question. I remember before we went out there, Lisa, who's a beautiful person, and I still keep in contact with her, the mother, it was really cold. And I remember her saying, does anyone need anything, like any hot chocolate or anything? And I thought, wow, she's 100% a mom. She was thinking about taking care of other people. And everybody there was just like searingly focused on her and what her facial expressions were and how she was going to react to things. And then when the cargo plane landed, I got out of the car, and as well, the family, and the gravity of it brought Lisa to her knees. I remember taking those photographs, and his fiance collapsed, and her father caught her. And I just, that was out-of-body experience too, because it was, I wasn't asking anybody anything. I was witnessing something. And so the story that I had to bring back was a narrative that I needed to write, because what are you going to ask somebody at that point? How hard is this on your heart? That's horrifying to ask somebody. It's the worst thing ever. What question could you ask besides just witness it and try and relay it?
I read the story at the time, and I reread the story before talking to you today. And I think the thing that struck me about how well it was written was the simplicity and the specificity of the details of that story were so striking and so heartbreaking. There are things that I think you pick up on, that these little things that you mentioned, like her being a mom in that situation to other people, just the little details that you pick out and were in your writing that day was, amazing. And I don't know that a lot, 10 different journalists will pick those things out. So I don't know that that's a question. That's just like me telling you about this story and how it impacted me.
We shouldn't have to write it, but thank you.
Later on that day, they take the body home. They take it from the airport in Madison to Portage, driving Highway 51, which is kind of a back road highway that goes from Madison to Portage. Along the way, there are people pulling over on the side of the road, kind of honoring him because they knew his body was going to be coming through that day. And in Portage as well, people lining the streets. What was it like from the family's perspective? Did they know that was coming, that outpouring was coming? And what was their reaction to it?
Well, they had, given me the most intense open access I've ever had of anything ever. And so I followed them to the funeral home, and they allowed me to take pictures in there. I wasn't in the car with the family when they were in the caravan, but while I was driving, there was, like, for instance, I remember for some reason a blue pickup truck, kind of a beat up old pickup truck, and a man that kind of looked like Santa Claus pull over the side of the road, get out, and put his hand over his heart. It would be lines of people. It was at the schools. There were, all the kids were out. And, I don't know if the children knew the gravity of it or really what happened. But like you said, it was such a huge processional, and it was just dotted from the time we left the airport with police escort to the time we arrived at the funeral home. I don't know if it was comforting, because I don't think anything could be comforting. But at least, people were recognizing and saying, we're stopping right now. Because I feel like, from personal experience, when somebody dies, time does stop. And everybody else keeps moving quickly around you. You think, why the hell is everybody moving so quickly when something tragic just happened to me? Slow the hell down. And I can only say, from my perspective, everybody slowed down. And they got out of their cars, and they got out of their shops, and they stood in the cold, and people, you could see people's breath in the air, and people crying and holding American flags and having banners. And I know that Lisa was just happy to have him physically near her.
You took a kind of a famous photo at the funeral home of Lisa, Daniel's mom, hugging his casket. Can you tell me about taking that photo? What the moment was like in the moment?
Yeah. It still gives me chills that that I was allowed to be that close to something so personal. I had kind of double checked that it was okay for me to go into the funeral home, because the last thing I wanted to do was in any way dishonor anybody or make them feel uncomfortable, because that's not who I am as a person, I'd like to think, and that's not who I wanted to be as a journalist. That doesn't garner anything. It doesn't help anybody. So I just remember walking in there. There's a casket. They pulled his casket out, and there was, an honor guard of, veterans, including World War II veterans, on the outside of the funeral home, and the police and the sheriff's station and firefighters all saluting him as his body was brought in. The casket was oak, lightly colored casket, half draped with an American flag. And I remember with flowers from everybody, around the circumference of it. And I was kneeling at it to get at a low angle. And also, really, to be truthful, to not be seen, because that wasn't my purpose. I was trying to, reporters never supposed to be in the story, or put themselves in the story. So I was trying to get as small as possible. And I'm a petite human, so I have a pretty small strike zone, like I'm a pretty small person. So also, I think in the throes of grief, I think that you have tunnel vision. And so I was kneeling down, and I remember Lisa walking in and just throwing her arms around the casket and saying, "He's home." And she cried, and I was crying, of course. And I just remember she was wearing a charm bracelet with his initials on it, DJT. And his father was standing a little bit behind, and then, his best friend. And it just, like I said before, it felt like something was, something beyond myself was capturing that moment, because I would never give myself that much credit. The credit goes to the people that are willing to open up their lives so that other people can see what pain looks like, because it is so vulnerable. And, all I know is that photo ran in a couple different papers, and that there was some people that wrote in and had, letters to the editor in like the State Journal and stuff saying, this is why war is hell, or this is why we should support our veterans. I mean, people had a narrative of their own about it. But the headline, I believe, was just what she said, which is he's home. And that's as close as she could get to him at that point until she was able to see his body physically, which I left for because that wasn't my place.
So tell me about the reaction to the photo when you brought it back to the newsroom.
I had never seen my editor or my publisher be emotional, But when I brought the photos back and I downloaded them, I remember both the publisher and the editor were standing around me. I clicked on that one picture of Lisa holding her son through the casket. And George, the publisher, just cried. And Jason, the editor, just cried. And they're both parents. And I'm not a parent. But I think that it hits people in different ways. And they just, they said, that's it. That's the photo. I just remember kind of, the cut line is something that you write underneath the photograph. And I said, something to the effect of pictured above is Lisa Thompson holding her only child. And her first words, through tears, of course, were, he's home. And so that became the headline. And yeah, it moved people in different ways. Like I was saying, if you're a parent like the editor and the publisher, where I think it hit them in a different way because they could only imagine that grief and that loss. And as a person, just looking at it, her face is so pained and also so loving at the same time to her son. It's almost like there was no casket in between them. She was just happy that she could be that close to him again.
I remember reading something that the editor, Jason Maddox, wrote a while after. The coverage was so intimate, so raw, that I worried some of the readers would think we were intruding without being invited. So I made the decision to put an editor's note on the front page telling readers about the access we were allowed. Did you feel at all uncomfortable about that kind of potential image as well? About being a journalist in that situation and what how people would view you for being the teller of that story from such an intimate point of view?
I actually was the person that asked the editor to make a note, because if it's photograph or the written word, people can interpret it 1,000 different ways based on what they read, what they see, how they feel about politics, how they, what's happened in their life. And I wanted to make it undoubtedly clear that I was not taking this lightly at all, and that there's no way in hell I would have been documenting any of it if I didn't have specific permission from his parents. And I needed that in order for me to continue to do the coverage. Otherwise, I couldn't do the coverage, because the thought of people perceiving me as taking it lightly or flippant or just, it's part of my job. It wasn't. It was part of my life. It still is. I still have his picture on my keychain that Lisa gave to me, and I would give her Mother's Day cards on Mother's Day and thanked her for introducing me to her son. I mean, there were times when she was comforting me, and I felt very embarrassed by it. But just to witness that much pain, I think over the course of maybe 2 months that I did it, you can't not feel connected, or at least I couldn't feel, disjointed from the reality of it. And I went to visit his grave before I left the paper and brought, flowers there with Lisa. And I still think about him all the time. I never met him.
I think a lot of journalists, they try to put up a front. They try to internalize things. They try to be, I don't know, they just try to... Stoic, yeah. And I think it's a little bit of a sense of uncomfortableness, a sense of not wanting to, or just to be an observer as much as possible. But the thing that I've always respected so much about you is... like you've mentioned earlier, the vulnerability in situations, being open instead of closing, which is a lot what most people will do in a situation like that. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage, I think, from my standpoint, because I don't know that I would have the ability to do that in that situation or a lot of the situations that you've reported on.
Thank you.
But this brings up, eventually you did decide to leave the Portage Daily Register and journalism. Why did you decide that you couldn't do it anymore?
I appreciate you thank you for saying that it takes courage to be open, because I'm not embarrassed or afraid or ashamed of people seeing my feelings. And quite frankly, I would not share my personal experiences with a journalist if they weren't walking through it with me. So why wouldn't I walk in that with people? And also, if someone's in pain, how can I not feel it? It's palpable. And it serves nobody to put up a front. Maybe the journalist for compartmentalizing and saying this is my job. But it's not a job. It's a vocation for me. It was a calling and a documentation of people's joy and pain and all of the emotions in between. And, after almost 10 years, I wrote a column explaining why I needed to leave, because in short, I think I began with this. I thought I would leave newspapers and journalism when I became hardened to it, because quite often, I was, jokingly seen or called like the crying reporter in the newsroom, because, if I did a story about a puppy mill, which I did, or, a story about a veteran or, somebody who was diagnosed with cancer for the third time and they're 23. I had to let all of that permeate through me in order to relay it in the most authentic way. And I decided to leave the newspaper because I didn't become hardened to it, because kind of for my own self-preservation, became almost too close to people, to the point where I thought I wouldn't be serving people well, because I didn't know if my emotions would get too in the way. I would become a narrator instead of a observer. And so I made the decision to leave, because I thought that was the most professional thing to do.
I'm wondering if you could read some of it. I printed it out, and I was just wondering if you wanted to read a certain part of it that you think kind of explains, because I think this is another one of the pieces of your writing that I love, and I reread this once in a while just because I think it's special, and I think it says something about journalism and you.
Thank you.
So I wonder if you wanted to read some part of it, maybe the last part or any part that strikes you.
Sure. So here's my truth. I became a journalist because it's a noble profession that serves the public. Here's the reality. Some people don't think it is. Journalists, good journalists, are in it because it feeds their soul. It will not fill their pockets. We don't get paid by the number of stories we produce, nor the word count or the quote-unquote sensationalism of a story. The journalists at the Daily Register and the ones I know in the industry do not seek out negative news. They report on what's occurred, be it a natural disaster, a fatality, or a crime. No one jockeys to cover devastation, but it comes with the territory. Reporters are like first responders that no one wants on the scene, and I often, as an aside, felt exactly like that. I hate witnessing pain, and I cringe at the illusion that I appear drawn to it, hence the editor's note. There's no debriefing for us after covering tragedy. Rather, there's a deadline for relaying it. The need to address mental health in the newsroom is sprouting up from the Associated Press and war correspondents to the local newspaper and community journalists. A handful of my former colleagues have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and have been prescribed medication. One reporter recalls every death on the stretch of a highway. Another has night terrors from being at an active shooter scene. Yet I never saw them shaken up firsthand, and they remained composed, but both left the profession. Here's my truth. My first day at the Daily Register landed on my 23rd birthday, and it remains one of the best decisions that I've ever made. At 32, I'm leaving for self-preservation. I can't disconnect from the stories I cover and the people affected. There are only so many antacids to consume, and I've collected all the handkerchiefs in the city from the kind veterans and police. And this last part is really the truth of who I am, I feel, as a person. I've learned to ask, are you okay? And not what happened when I approach a scene. When someone tells me I might cry, I say, that's okay, I might cry with you. I've learned that being emotionally vulnerable is a strength of mine and not a weakness. Here's the reality. I've grieved over leaving the Daily Register for months. I'm deeply grateful for your trust and the courage it takes to be authentic.
What do you think? I don't know if you've read this since you've been gone. It's been a couple of years now. I think it's been 2 years about. Have you read that in the last 2 years? Have you thought about that? And what is it reading that bring up to you now that you kind of put that chapter to bed in your life?
I do reread that because it's one of my most, that was unfiltered, I was speaking my truth, and I felt that everybody who ever allowed me to take a picture of them or quote them deserved 100% authenticity from me. And I wasn't going to ask that from them and not deliver it myself. One, because that's unfair, and two, because that's not who I am. And in general, I feel like I still live by that. I don't say, what happened? When I go to some place or a scene, like, everybody's in pain, and whether or not they let you see it is the difference. I witnessed things, and I'm still, I still text Lisa, and there's a rock with a plaque dedicated to him near the primate area at the zoo in Madison. And, when I go to the zoo, I take a picture of it and send it to her. And, every time I look at my keys, I see his face. I don't know, the all access to somebody's pain and their heart, lay it out there and say, and I trust you to tell this, whatever story it is, even if it's just about, not just, but if it's about a new library opening, getting the numbers right, quoting people correctly, spelling their name accurately. And I felt like my vocation was to give people a voice, to show people in pictures, photographs, and to acknowledge and validate, and what they said matters. And I feel like everybody wants that in life. I feel like everybody's looking for that.
It was a pleasure to talk to Jen. She's one of my heroes, and she was so gracious to talk about her experiences, which were not always easy ones by any means. I'll post some links to some of her articles on the website at wispod.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Cheers.